Everybody, settle down there, folks. Come on. Barbara Dill, a member of longstanding in our club. She's so well regarded and so well known about her multi-axis turning that when I went out looking for demonstrators for this year and early next year, and I said, hey, what about, they said, hey, I do multi-axis turning. I would say, well, Barbara Dill is a member of our club. Oh, never mind. Barbara Dill is the lady that wrote the book. And so tonight you're getting a treat for free that people pay real money for. Barbara's been an AAW member. She's done I think we're free. Anyhow, Barbara's done a lot of demonstrations. Tonight will be a treat, probably one we can't repeat very often. But I introduced Barbara Dill. She wrote the book.
Thank you. Thank you. Well, it's absolutely my pleasure to be here. I was sitting in the back looking at everybody and what's going on and feeling how grateful I am to have entered this world of wood turning. It's been an amazing journey for me. I'm retired now. I'm not traveling anymore. I'm still turning. And I love to talk about multi-axis stuff, and I love to talk about wood turning. So I thought what we'd do tonight is start with a PowerPoint presentation about how this work evolved. How did I ever get into it, and then how it evolved through the 35 plus years. It's limited. I mean, it's not going to be forever. It's going to be like 15 minutes. And if I go longer than that, cut me off. So, okay, let's do that presentation now. Okay, you can go ahead. I was a nurse for 21 years, and we took the Smithsonian Magazine, and when I dragged myself out of the ER, I have a master's in psychiatric nursing, and I worked as a psychiatric nurse in ERs for many years. I saw that image of the wooden fish bowls in the Smithsonian, and it spoke to my soul. It was the most beautiful thing. I had never worked with wood, and this was like 87, 88. And my wife, who's sitting here, Shelley, had said, you know, so the next day, a flyer came from Henrico Adult Education. It was wood carving. So Shelley said, you should look into that. So I did, and I was able to make that fishbowl that I created after learning how to sharpen tools, learning how to read the grain of the wood. It was just amazing, though, to be able to walk out of such a intense environment and then carve wood. I just loved it. And I retired from nursing in 1990. Okay, you can go to the next slide. And I went to Aramont, and the first teacher was Michael Hasseluk. And they had general lathes back then, and that picture was 91. I took a weeks-long class. I was the only woman and the only beginner in that class. But they were really nice to me, thank goodness. Came back, bought a lathe. I've been turning wood ever since. Went to Aramont the next 2 summers. Now I can't see what the next slide is, but go ahead and do it. And then studied with Ray Key one summer, and then the next summer David Ellsworth. And it's just random, the teachers you get when you are able to go there. And I absolutely loved every class that I took. This is in our backyard when we lived on the north side of Richmond. I started doing craft shows to try to earn enough money to pay for my toys at least. And I was just really having a good time. Next slide. And then in 93, I got this flyer from, it was a worldwide turning conference. It was in Delaware. So Shelley and I went up there. And what I saw there were people from all over the world who were doing all sorts of off-center turning as well as amazing other turnings. And I got really interested in it. Next. So I came home and I turned that spindle. And you can click on that because there's an arrow that you'll see. So I thought you had to separate the axes by a lot of space to get something really dramatic. That's the first one I made. I kept all my fingers, thankfully. I started with a rectangular piece of wood and then did that axis and then centered it. So next slide. But during the 90s, I was fascinated with multi-axis, and I didn't know what I was doing. So I would randomly change the axis and do something else, and I must have made hundreds of those. But I didn't know what to do next, and I got really frustrated because I didn't know how to think about it. So I sort of gave it up. And in 2006, Mark Spheri was a visiting artist at VCU. And I kept saying to him, why don't you tell us what you're thinking? And he said, I am. You just do this and you do that. And I thought, well, somebody's got to figure this out. Next slide. So I went, and by that time, we had moved out to Rockville, and I had built this wonderful shop. I have a lot of space in it, unlike my first shop, where I had to clean a path every time I did something. And I had the peacefulness and the space to really play. I isolated myself, and I thought, I'm going to make all these spindles and see if I can figure out what they have in common. Okay, next. So, and I also was making a lot of bowls and coring out bowls. I really was enjoying my life as a woodturner versus going into a hospital every day and dealing with very difficult situations. It was just joyful to me to be able to do this. Next. So I started making a lot of spindles, and they're different than the ones I made. I was slender pieces of wood, and I wanted to see what they had in common. Next. So, this is what I figured out. Now you can hit a button because you'll see an arrow. There are only two ways the new axis can be placed relative to that center axis. It's either parallel, like that arrow shows, next, or it's twisted, which means it's parallel to the center axis, relative to that center axis. Or it's not parallel, relative to that center axis, or any axis parallel to that center axis. Wow, okay, just two ways to place the axis. Next. Next. And then, arrow. There are only two outcomes. When you have a new axis, you either cut into the air wood, which is not the solid wood, but it's the wood that comes around and you hit it once, and cut a profile in the air wood, or you go all the way through the air wood and capture the solid wood on that new axis and create a profile on that. Wow, that's making sense to me now. Okay. And so hit an arrow. So the axis placement, I'm just going to go into this for 1 second. The axis placement really only makes a difference when you're doing a circular type outcome, because if you put the axis closer to the outside of the spindle, the radius defines the diameter of that piece of wood, and it's going to be really thin. So the axis on a circular piece, go ahead and hit another button, should be in the middle of the radius or towards the center of the spindle. And that way you get a lot more solid wood to work with. With arc type, you can hit another one, it really doesn't matter if the axis is closer to the outside of the spindle, the radius is longer and the arc that you cut is flatter. And then another one. So when the new axis is put in the middle or closer to the center, then those arcs are smaller, more curved because the radius is smaller. So those are just factors that make a lot of sense when you're doing this kind of work, okay? And the other important thing, and I won't go into it now, is that in order to not get a brain cramp, all of you know what that is when you change the axis, you have to have a systematic way to number your axes so that you know what you've done. I used to have a piece of paper and I'd write what I did after I had no idea what I did, because I couldn't understand what I wrote, so I write on the wood. I number them on the wood and on the outside of the wood. Okay, next. Oh, I forgot to bring my handouts, but you can get them off my website, which is barbaradill.com. But so this represents those ideas I just gave you. There are only two ways the axis can be moved relative to the center axis. Parallel are the top two quadrants, and twisted are the bottom two quadrants. And there are only two outcomes. The left quadrants are the arc type, and the right quadrants are the circular type. So now we have four families that have these two things in common. So now I would wake up every morning and I'd say, I wonder what would happen if I did this. What if I used three axes, or what if I twisted them? So it became, a lot of people thought I was obsessed, and maybe I was. Maybe I still am. Okay, next. And the other important factor to remember is there are a set of variables that apply to every quadrant, every spindle, or every part of a spindle. And they have to do with the size and the shape of the wood, and the profile. Go ahead and hit another button. The profile that you turn, and I define a profile as simply a bead, a cove, or a V-cut. And the third thing is the axis placement, the new axis. So under those categories, you can see how many variables there are that you can apply to every idea that you might have. Okay, next. So now, this is the room that it happened, actually. In 2006, Tom Crabb, I told him what I had figured out, and he said, oh, you have to demo it with the club. And I could hardly verbalize it. I saw it, but it was hard to really talk about it or explain it. But I did it, and I used to carry around those boards with Velcro on them and carry around my spindles when I taught. So this is the room that it all happened. So Tom said, you got to do it. And then I went to the Virginia Symposium, and then the rest is history. I kept writing about it, understanding it more, and just having a lot of fun with it. Okay, next. So the upper left, the upper left image shows what I did in the 90s. In the 2000s, I started making smaller spindles, thinner spindles, and somebody at a demo said, what are you going to do with them? And I said, I have no idea. I'm just fascinated with what happens when you do all this stuff. And so I started making these goblets, and these goblets, the only off-center piece are the stems. The cup and the base are all on one axis, and they're joined by mortise and tenon joinery. Next. And then I started, it took years though to unwind, to figure these things out. So this wonderful example of a three-sided spindle, it's arc type and it's in quadrant 2. I thought, wow, I wonder what would happen if I did it on a squattier piece of wood and I could make a three-sided cup. So, did my mic just go out? That's all. So the point of all this is to show you that these small ideas that you have, that you work with to understand this process, you're not only getting your skill level up, but you're developing ideas that will grow into larger ideas. Okay, next. And then I started thinking, what happens if you don't use the center of this axis when I attach it to something? And I started playing around with using different type of axes. And next. And then I got really interested in split turnings, and I'm talking about how these ideas developed through the years. I wanted to do bigger pieces of wood, and the lathe is really unbalanced when you're doing off-center turning. So I started doing split turnings where you can put 2 or 4 pieces of wood together, glue them up, and you can do 20 or 24 inches long and 4 inches wide, get them all together, and you can turn some amazing things. So, and those are all going to be parallel axes that are found in the first quadrant. So if you make little things in the first quadrant, you can grow it into a bigger idea on bigger pieces of wood by doing split turnings. So this image, these were published in our journal in 2011, I think. And they're all parallel axes. The ones on the left I've turned off 4 sides. The ones on the right, just 2 sides. And next. And I started playing around with not finishing this thing on the center axis. So what would happen if I did that? I did those. I'm not fond of them, but it was just in part of the learning process of what would happen if. Okay, next. And this is what happened next, is that I had an idea of putting the cove and the bead together and turning these, and 1 out of every 4 would break because it's really difficult to finish them. I finished the bottom on one end of a diagonal and the top on the other side of the diagonal. So it's technically difficult turning, but I really liked them. And they got published next in the journal. And so I had to do it again. Well, I couldn't do it again. I had beginner's luck. So it took me another month or 2 to figure out how did I get that curve on top of the other curve and how did I do that. So it was a process, but I finally figured all that out. But I wanted to mention Peter Exton here. During that time I was exploring split turnings, he was demonstrating and he wrote a great article in the journal. And if you're interested in split turnings and what can be done, his website is amazing. He cuts wood into triangles, diamonds, rather than squares. And his work is phenomenal. So next. And then I got accepted to go to International Turning Exchange in Philly. I ended up not being able to go for various reasons, and one was my mother lived here and she was getting older. But I went up there and I met Luc Deroux, who does that famous butt sculpture, and he does multi-axis work. So I said, how did you do it? And he said, 2 axes. He wouldn't say anymore. So I had to come home and do that. So I started, because of that, working with squarish pieces of wood rather than longer pieces of wood. So I did a whole series of those, and on that, the spout is part of that piece of wood. It was just, I cut back that surface and used the spout as one piece of wood. Okay, next. And then there is a whole thing about using the tenon, the 4-jaw chuck, and throwing a cup off so that you can hollow the top off, hollow the cup out, and then throw it out using a 4-jaw chuck and create multi-axis things. So I did that for a while. Okay. Next. Oh, never mind. We won't go there. Next. And so I developed quite a few of these nice little cups. They happen to be on the cover of my book, which, by the way, I did bring some extra copies. They cost $30, but I do have some here if anybody's interested. Or I have a website, and a lot of my papers and videos can be taken. They're links from my website to a lot of videos. It helps you see this a lot better, but you're going to see some tonight. Okay, next. And then, what year was that? In 2012, I was invited by the AAW to be in a show. Well, I'm not a conceptual turner, and I didn't want to do it, but everybody said I should, so I drove myself nuts that fall. I came up with nothing that I thought was conceptual. And just when I was ready to say, I'm sorry, I'm not going to do it, I saw that piece on the right in my windowsill, and it's an earlier piece that I had done, and I thought, and the constraints were to make this object in a 6-inch cube. Okay. So I came up with this piece called Harmony, and that's all out of one wood. It's just the piece I showed you before shrunk into a cube, a 6-inch cube. But it only took me months to learn how to, to really learn how to do it. Okay. And there are the axes. For some reason on that earlier piece, I had struck a diagonal and placed these twisted axes on the diagonal. I don't know why I did that, because it wasn't normal for me to do that, but then that worked for this piece as well. And there's actually an article in the journal that I published that explains how that happened. Okay. And then I got this invitation that everybody got from Aramont in 2013, and I thought, well, I did one conceptual piece, maybe I can do another. And it's called The Light of the Moon. So I did something really stupid. You all remember Jim Bumpus? Well, I showed Jim what I was thinking, and he said, Barbara, you can do better than that. So I went back to the drawing board, and next. So all these little spindles, and I have them in a box right here, these are the little things that I played with when I was just figuring things out. And it's this little spindle right here. It's that's coves. Alternating beads. Well, it's in the picture anyhow. Here it is. Alternating beads on 2 parallel axes. See how small I would do it, because I was just experimenting and I had to carry them around to teach. So this, I thought, oh, Rising of the Moon. I forgot what the title was, and I thought, oh, if I develop this idea, then maybe I could be in this show. Okay, next. Yep. Uh-oh. Okay, so that's the alternating beads. So I did it on a larger piece. Next. And I entered the show and I didn't get in. But it started me on this other journey, next, of playing with these little ideas and putting them on larger pieces of wood. So alternating beads, alternating coves, V-cuts. I had just put them on 2 parallel axes. What if I did it on 3 or 4? What if I twisted them? What if I did them as a split turning and made larger turnings? So that's the rabbit hole that came next for me. Okay, next. So hit that button, because here's what it looks like. Hit that button. So here's a split turning with 4 pieces of wood, and they're they're turned on all four sides, alternating beads, so because they're four axes, each side the bead would advance by a quarter of the length of it, and so on. Okay, next. I always do. And I always have my phone right here because, you know, safety is so important. We all work alone, so you have to make sure you don't get hurt and nobody knows. So there's another rabbit hole, going into these split turnings and playing with all of these ideas. So next. Okay, hit that button. And here's one. And I don't know if you can hear that. I'm just saying. It took me years to start twisting that. And the fun is just watching the wood dance, I think. I think it's really fun. Okay, next. And that's just an image of doing parallel axes. I would put a piece of tape on my tool rest because often, and I'd mark the wood with colors so I'd know how to advance each one of those coves, but they'd get erased when you turned. So you just figure out things as you go along. Okay, next. And this piece happened. I love the trio of them, but the walnut one on the left is one of those split turnings that I did. The cherry one in the middle are alternating beads, and the one on the right, the holly one, are alternating coves. And the significant one about that is if you alternate the coves, and I've challenged Dan to do this, you can make a screw because that ridge squirrels all the way up just like the screw. So if you were Dan and you wanted to make a real screw, you could do it. So next. I did multi-axis snowmen. Next. I love Rudy Osalnik's work, and I have a demo piece that he did. I'd go to Tennessee, my home state, and go to some of their things in the 90s. So I thought, well, a three-sided thing like this, I can make a candle holder out of it. So I just made an asymmetrical cove on each side, and I think those are great. And by the way, none of these are signature pieces. These are pieces that are available to any of you who like these forms and want to make them. Nobody owns this at all. It's a conception. It's a concept. It's not a signature piece. Next. And then one of my alternating beads broke, so I started playing with smaller squarish pieces of wood. Next. And hit that again. So that's the way it looks. The first axis has that bead in the middle and two halves, and then the second axis has the beads on the outside. So all I'm doing, I'm just showing you that it takes a lot of time once you have an idea like this to figure out what you can do to make it grow. And so the reason I've enjoyed teaching this so much is that I don't want people to start with that. I want people to start with this, right? So let's just buzz on through a few more slides and then we'll get started with the demo. Okay, yeah, those are, so I always make hundreds of those ideas, so I have to refine my skill and I have to figure out where the axes are going to be. Okay, next. So we'll just buzz through this. Big pieces of cedar, and next. And then the wave form came because I made that candle holder one winter, and I wanted a multi-axis segment in the middle, and it was twisted from the top and the bottom 90 degrees, but the twist there was like 30 degrees. And I thought, well, I don't like that, but if I make those twisted coves on a squarish piece of wood, it might make something really nice, which is that called the wave. And the center spindle is one of the ones that I just started with. I turned it a long time ago, and I thought to myself, well, that looks like a spinal column. I'll never go there. But when you take it, segment it off, and twist it, it becomes a really nice form. So once again, what I want to show you is how to start with really simple ideas and get your skill level up and your understanding up, and then grow them into larger things. So that's enough. That's enough. It's time to get turning. So the project that I'm going to turn tonight is a three-sided cup. They can be all different sizes. They can be short and squatty with a V. Now I'm going to mess up your camera work, aren't I? I'm moving around. I'll pass these around. Instead of a cove like this, there's a V cut there. It looks sort of like a spaceship to me, but that's what happened. Here I can pass these around. There you go. But basically what we're going to do is make a cup similar to this. But with this same idea, you can also make a larger candlestick. It's all the same. It's just a different size of wood, shape of wood. So let's start with a three parallel axes separated by 120 degrees. Now, they don't have to be separated equally, but most of my work I do that. I've seen a lot of people separate them asymmetrically, and that works differently. It's different. And these are two parallel axes, and what I'm going to do is put this on the other axis and show you how simple it is. Let me move this. But notice on this spindle, I have marked the ends with a magic marker, and I've numbered the numbers on the outside because it's really clumsy to look around and see what the numbers are. And what you want to do is give yourself hardly any opportunity to have a brain cramp. So if you mark these really clearly, the chances are you won't. But then it's always easy to have a brain cramp. So brain. Well, that's what I call it. All right, so when I put a piece of wood on, I always turn the speed down. I turn the lathe on. Make sure the tool rest is in a good place. I'll put that down a little. And then I'll put my face shield on. So this is, if you're interested in doing the cup, this is where you should start. 3 parallel axes, and then do a spindle just like that, and do 3 twisted axes. And my 2 favorite tools are this bowl gouge. It's a 1/2-inch bowl gouge, but it's sharpened just like a roughing spindle gouge. I have more control over that than I do with the larger roughing spindle gouge. And the other tool that I use is a 1/2-inch spindle gouge sharpened with a fingernail grind. So what I'm going to do is start off, because I can use this bowl gouge. I use the tool that will make the smoothest cut because I hate sanding, just like most of us do. So, and the speed of the lathe makes a big difference. The faster it goes, the faster you can move your tool. And I don't know how that affects the light, affects the camera. So are you going to zoom in? All right. Now that, see, that does it out. Okay. So now now in my shop, I will speed the lathe up until it vibrates. But here, I think it's pretty sturdy on a cement. So I feel a little vibration here, but then there are harmonics. I'll get out of the way of it. And if you go past those harmonics, you can speed it up as well. So the faster it goes, the less bounce there seems to be. So because it's a curve, I want to start in the middle. I do need the light. And I just take really gentle cuts. Just like you would on one axis. You start in the middle and you work back and forth. Nice light cuts. This is the zen of turning wood. Just take your time, make nice cuts. Let's see what I've done so far. And this is archetype, so as you define the profile on each axis, it's intersecting with the other axes, and it makes those really beautiful lines of intersection. So I'll talk about depth of cut when I do the cup. So right now I'll just keep making that a little deeper to match the other coves, and then we'll move on. Yes. 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 Well, on an archetype piece, I'll put a Jacob's chuck here, have a disc there, and I'll carefully do that axis with that disc. So I don't want to interfere with these lines of intersection, so I'm really careful about that. I always hand sand it with the lathe holding the sandpaper, and I can have a lot of control over how the sandpaper hits it. Great question. Thank you. Anything else? Well, I'm holding it, and the machine's spinning the disc with the Jacob's chuck. But I'm holding this very carefully and making sure that I'm sanding just this part and not the edges, just this part here. I'm holding the piece. The lathe is holding the sandpaper. It's my assistant. All right. So now that I know the tool rest is okay, I will make sure that's tight. I'll turn it back on. No need to turn it down and up again. This is a great lathe, by the way. Very nice. Yes? Right. All right. I have popsicle sticks, and I use the tool rest as a reference. And so I'll measure the first axis where it's the deepest if it's asymmetrical, and I'll put a line on that so I can see how deep it is, and on each axis I will do that. That's right. You can't move your tool rest. Right. I stop and start a lot when I turn. All right, so let's turn a three-sided cup. I went out and prepped this wood a few days ago. It was frozen, and my bandsaw didn't like cutting frozen wood. So it's cracked a little here. I'm going to put that on the bottom. Yes? It's the way that you set up the... yes, so three-sided, let's say this is the end of a spindle. If I create a three-sided thing like I just did, I have three axes. Now they don't have to be separated by 120 degrees. They can be like that. They can be any degrees. There are no rules about this. Most of my work, though, is like that. So that's what I mean.
When you say three-sided, you mean you got three axes,
Yes.
as opposed to four axes.
Right, as opposed to 4 or 5 or 6 or whatever. Yeah. Well, I've found out that 3 is my favorite just because the more axes you use, the more it becomes circular. It's not as dramatic. So, but you know, all this is just up for play. I mean, all of us are different, the things we think are beautiful and the way we want to work. So that's why if you understand just how to think about it, your whole trajectory is going to be probably very different than mine. Yes? That was parallel. So it was 1-1. So I set it up that way, 1 to 1, 2 to 2, and 3 to 3. This one's going to be twisted. Fast, as fast as I could. I need to turn it down now because I just put But I like speed. Derek Weidman turns very slowly. Yes, he says. But as long as the lathe doesn't vibrate and I feel safe, if I have it on a really off axis, I might be afraid it might fly out, so I won't do it then. Yes? No, sharp tools probably. Yeah. Or some woods are just going to tear out. But there's not one simple answer to that, I think. Yeah, I was that way too. When I first started turning, I would call myself a bowl sander. Anyhow, let me get this down and we'll talk about how to create this cup. I like to turn green wood. We were talking about dust. It's not quite as much dust, although there is dust. My tool rest, for me, makes a big difference. I brought mine from home. It has a nice way for me to put my hand underneath it and control the tool any way I would like to, put the heel of my hand on it. So I get used to just a tool rest. Now I'm going to use a parting tool and flatten these ends. Now what I used to do when I first started this, is I would then scribe a circle on each end. The circle on the top would be the diameter, it would be for the mouth part. So this tenon would define the depth of the cut. Well, no, anyhow, I'd define a circle on each end so I'd know where I'd put the axes. The top part would be smaller than the bottom part. But I stopped doing it that way because I also use these lines for depth of cut. So on each axis, I want the same depth of cut on each axis. So instead of having to lean over and see where I am relative to that circle, what I started doing is that there, creating a tenon on each end, which would represent the depth of cut. So here's one that hasn't been hollowed out yet. Here's what I'm going to do next is create a tenon, and that way I can define the depth of cut on each end. Now the bottom tenon can be larger than the top because the base needs to be pretty stable. So, you just play around with these ideas. Now what I'm going to do is put a piece of some chalk on these tenons so I can see it. And now there are many ways to mark the axes. I used to have one of these that I bought, but I lost it in my travels, so I got this off the internet. Keep forgetting that I'm on camera. And made this that I can put on my Powermatic and get any angle that I want. And then for three-sided ones, I just made a smaller 1, and is that the indexing jig? That's what they're called. And that way I can put that on my lathe, put the piece of wood back in. Yes, that's the top. And I can mark these axes pretty accurately this way. I can look at the wood and find out, is there anything I want to avoid? Here's a crack right here. So I don't want that to be one of the points. So I can adjust this so that I can scribe an axis there, scribe an axis here, and scribe one here. So now I can take this off. There are other ways to do this. I brought in some of these that I made. I can also put this on the end and find some axes, just little plastic pieces. So I'm not going to use those tonight. Now I will mark, I don't know where the camera is. I'll draw this line to the center. I could use a ruler, but I'm not. Draw this to the center, and it crosses the circle that I drew. And I'll do that on each end because I do want the twist here to be 120 degrees. If I didn't want the twist to be that 120, if I want it to be more or less, then I would have to number it differently, and they'd still be separated at 120 degrees, but I could arrange the top to be any kind of angle like that. So, but these are going to be 120. And I will number them 1, 2, and 3. And on the top, 1, 2, and 3. So I've got that done, and now what I'm going to do is press in this 4-prong drive center that I have because this joint from the headstock to this piece of wood is going to be really important. I can put a lot of pressure on a project like this because it's a solid piece of wood, but on the longer, the thinner spindles, you have to really pay attention to this joint right here. So I'll start with 2. I can press this in 2, and my system is going 2 to 3. And I think what I want to do is make these tenons just a little smaller at the top here. So let me do that real quick. Any questions? Yeah. Right. Any rule of thumb about how far you can offset the axes? There is on circular types. If the axis is here on the circular type, you'll have a smaller piece of solid wood than you would if the axis was here. On arc type, though, when you put an axis here, you're cutting into this wood. And the shorter the radius, the more curved that arc will be. So it's more critical on circular type than it is on arc type. But you'll find out all this by making all the mistakes I've made. That's how you learn. Yeah, that's better, I think. Maybe even smaller. Okay. Once again, I'll put the chalk on it so I can see it. And now press in the axes. I'll start at 2 to 3. Well, I did have a circle scribe there, but I erased it, so now I'm just going to judge it by the width of this half-inch point. So I'll do it visually. And I'm going to press this in really tightly. How do you freeze the... I don't know how to freeze the shaft. Does anybody know how to freeze? Anyhow, that button. Right here. Aha. Okay, so I freeze the shaft and wiggle it so that that bites into the wood, because when that fails, you have to figure out another way to make a new axis. So that's 2 to 3, 3 to 1 in sequence. And when you make a tenon like this, you really want the axis to be, what is this? Thank you, 3 to 1. You want the axis to be in a place that is not going to be at the very edge of that tenon so that it tears out the end grain. And wiggle it and push it in. Three to 1, and then 1 to 2. And that's where we'll start. So now I'll turn the speed down, adjust the tool rest first so that I know it's not going to throw this piece of wood off and hit you, which would be not cool. But I want it as close as I can get it. You brought your catcher's mitts, right? Turn the speed way down, then start. And I'm going to use this tool, my bowl gouge, sharpened like a roughing gouge, spindle roughing gouge. And I'm just going to define the depth of cut on each end. And I put the chalk there so it helps me see it, but I also turn the lathe off and on all the time just so I can see what I've done. So I haven't touched that tenon yet, and I've not quite touched that. So I know I can cut a little deeper on each end. And now what I'm going to do is turn a cove at the bottom and then a bead that goes towards the top. I really like this shape rather than a shape that just flares out. But there are all sorts of shapes, there are all sorts of sizes of wood that you can use. That's what I'll do next. I'll make sure it's tight, turn it back on. Stop it and let's see what I've done. So that's developing nicely. I still need to take some wood out and make that cove a little deeper, but I've done as deep as the cut, as deep as it should be on the top. So tighten it up once again, make sure you're tight. Huh? And what I'm looking at is the horizon right here. The light helps me see the profile and the gray floor is what I'm looking at as a contrast. For a long time, I tried to figure out how to visualize on each axis the very same curve I was creating, and I would draw a line and put a piece of paper back here, and I finally gave up. It's just doing it a lot that you get a sense of how the curves are going to match. So now, because this is a solid piece of wood, I think I'm going to stop on this axis and go to the next one. I'm going to make that a little deeper, though, because there's a ridge there. But before I do that, I'll measure the depth and then see how they're intersecting. But I think this is going to work nicely. Let me just do that one little last cut here. So that was 1 to 2. Then I'll go from 2 to 3. And do the same thing. If I wanted the twist to go in the other direction, I would number it oppositely because I can't do the math in my head. I can't think backwards, so it's all about making the numbers work for me. So if I wanted the twist to go the other way, I'd do it reversed. Oh, I forgot to do the depth of cut. Let me do that because that is really important with this project. I forgot to show you, Dan, how to use that. Well, why didn't you speak up? Come on. Let's see, what axis was that? That was 1 to 2. Thank you. 1 to 2. Yep. So now I will remember that this was another project, so I'll make an X through that. And I'll use this. I'm not going to move my tool rest. In fact, I could move it up a little bit, I think. Now I'm going to mark the tool rest at the deepest part of that cove, and I'll make a mark so that I can see the depth of that cut. And now I'll use that as a reference point. One to 2, 2 to 3. And if I'm unsure about putting that on the lathe correctly, instead of touching it with a tool, I will touch it with chalk. Because sometimes you can see it visually, but that's chalk is showing me that I have it on the right axis. That's what I'll be cutting next. So there are a lot of things to do to try to get you to not make the wrong cuts. Let's see where I'm at. So I can cut a little more on this end. This end's good, and then I'll fix that and make a cove. And let's see. Oh, that looks great. That looks very good. And see how the axes now have come together? It makes that really beautiful line. So that was 2. Oh, 3 to 1. Okay, yeah. 3 to 1. That's right. Find the hole that I pressed in. There you go. 3 to 1. And that's it, right there. Same thing, just find the depth of cut on this axis, on each end. You can see how the wood changes. The solid wood and the air wood change on each axis. There's less wood going around. So still a little to go on each end and do the cove. You can also tell by the width of each cove if it's close, but I'll measure it. On the videos that I've made, there's some videos about this, and I'm intending to put more out. What time is it? We're doing okay. All right, tighten that up. Let me finish this cut, then we'll move on to how to do it. Maybe a hair deeper, and then we'll move it back to the center axis. Oops. trying to make the smoothest cut I can so I don't have to sand it too much. There you go. Ah! Get rid of that. Stop it. Okay, that looks good. So let's say that I've made the best cuts I can. I want to clean that up because I don't want to have to deal with it later. So I feel like there's something in my nose, but it's this. All right, so let's say that's good. I have 3 axes. I would do better in my own shop. I wouldn't want to do that because that involves a lot of sanding those ridges. Now I'm going to put it back on the center axis. And what I'm going to do is a couple of things. I'm going to create a tenon on this end that's going to fit my 4-jaw chuck because I'll need to hollow it out. And I have jigs in my shop. I brought my old Nova chuck, and I know the tenon can be plus or minus that. So I have an instant guide to use to make that diameter correct. But the other things I want to do are, see this little, well, that doesn't look very good. See, there's a cut here that you go down on the points and it sort of makes it sit on the table differently. And I want to make a concave cut on the top so that these points will be more prominent as well. So that I used to do better when I was younger. I used to use my spindle gouge for all of it. It's not as easy to do anymore, so I use other tools. But I'm going to do these points here. I'm going to turn them down. First I'll make the tenon the right size. And I'm also thinking about the bottom of the bowl, the bottom of the cup and how large I want that bottom to be. So that will be good. The next step is to take my spindle gouge and make this cut. And I'm just going to intersect these points and roll down. That's the bottom. Yep. So that's good. And let me fix this tenon. Oh, it's okay. And then on the top, I'll use my parting tool and get rid of a lot of that tenon. I'm cutting down into the cup now. And there's a little curve there and the points are prominent, but I need to make a better cut than that. So I have a smaller little parting tool that I've sharpened so that it's higher on one end than the other, and it's very sharp. So if I do this right, I'll make a perfect cut, and if I don't, I'll mess up the tips. So let's do it. And I'm messing them up. So let's see what's going on. You're not behaving. Oh, I haven't messed it up yet. Wait a minute. And that's an example of how some days one tool works better than the other. So I think that's a pretty successful cut, but it had me tense. So now, I was going to set it up for hollowing, but I'd rather answer any questions you have, or I could put my 4-jaw chuck on it and begin the hollowing process. When you hollow it, though, you want to make sure that you're measuring it in the middle of those beads, because otherwise it's thinner there than it would be here. So that's the only trick to hollowing it. Yes? Mm-hmm. Oh, look, there's a flat spot there. Okay, so that's what I should have noticed. Since there's a flat spot there, I could have gone back and really tweaked those 2 axes to make sure. But then sandpaper is your friend, because now I can sand it out. Yes? All right. Yep, I didn't notice that, but this is good. That's good. So one of these axes, probably this one, I could have taken more wood off of it. Yes? I do that. Yeah, so once I get the inside hollowed, then I'll take a carving knife or a rotary tool and pare the width of the outside all the way into that triangle. Yeah. So once again, anybody who can do 3 axes parallel and twisted on a long piece of wood can certainly do a lot of these projects. It just takes a lot of practice and experimentation on the lathe. Any other questions? I don't think it matters. Here's one of the ones on a longer piece. I brought these in. So here's one of the candle holders that I made. And it's a cove, 3-sided cove, but the twist is 60 degrees. I decided on a long piece of wood I didn't want a big twist. So you can play around with the amount of twist on each end as well. But I think these are as fun to make as these. I mean, yeah. Yes? Well, I don't make a living at this. I have made more teaching and writing about it and demonstrating it than I have making. I'm an experimental turner. You know, I'll make something. If it doesn't work out, I'll move on. And like I said, some of these spindles I came back to years later and found some really nice things in them. So I had the luxury of not having to pay the rent doing this work. Thank you, Shelley. My wife of 40 years. She's been wonderful. She supports the arts, that's for sure. Yeah. Yeah. Any other questions? Yes. Is to start small and start maybe not as small as some of these, but just start with smaller pieces of wood and start experimenting with parallel and twisted axes, arc type and circular type. Here's a circular type one right here. But you know, so I think we all start off with randomly changing the axis to see what happens. But with this information, you can do it with an idea about what to do next. Oh, I could use 3 axes. Oh, I could use a larger piece of wood. I could make an asymmetrical cove or something. So the sky's the limit in terms of creativity once you get it. It's a lot like music theory. You know, how do all these spindles interact with each other? How do all those notes interact with each other? Somebody asked me, I was doing a Zoom session, and they said, how did you figure it out? What's in your background that made you figure it out? And I said, well, I was a nurse, and I learned how to scientifically think about things. But my father was a musician, and my sister and I both played brass instruments from grammar school on up. And we sang 4-part harmonies. And I think I understand how much time it takes just to learn a new process, and I'm willing to focus and do that. And I think that's what it takes. In my experience, a lot of people who try this kind of turning go for the biggest, most complicated project. They don't do it well, and they give up. And that's why I keep saying go for the small ideas and then build on those. So, any other questions or comments? Yeah. Right. Well, that gave my brain a big cramp because I would number them the same, and then it didn't work. So I started just going 1 to 1, 2 to 2, and 3 to 3. So if I wanted, this would be 1, and then I would have 1 there. So, but then I'd forget that sometimes, and then the twist would be enormous. It would be like 160 degrees. So you have to really remember what you've done once you do it. There are many ways to number these things and to think about them.
Well, on this illustration, you have the 1 and 1 in the position on the circle, right? You could
That's right. That's right. I could do that on these cups. For some reason, I've always just done 120 degrees. I've never done 3 axes at 160 or at 100. And see, there's so many ways you can play with these ideas. It's amazing. Any other questions or comments? Well, thank you, Al. Thank you. I'm really honored to be a part of this club. This is really all where it started. That Tom Crabb, noticed what I had done or kicked me to do more. So, and I've always just loved. I mean, this whole chapter of my life, I never dreamt of it. I thought I'd be 100 and the director of nursing somewhere. I'd be fat and a cigarette in my mouth. So.